Hi, my name is Bethany Aidroos. I have a master's in European history. I specialize in the history of medicine in early modern Europe. I'm interested particularly in women's medical work in hospitals and as midwives. This is fascinating because they have quite the contentious relationship with male doctors, so it provides a lot of fertile ground for me to study. Well, I can speak best to the case of the medieval period, why rats liked to live near humans. I'll talk more about that in detail. But basically, there's a lot of garbage on medieval streets. So the rats are attracted to that. And it's just dirtier, there's more places for them to hang out. People aren't going to be as concerned with getting them away from the streets and away from their living establishments as we are. No, they wouldn't want them in there eating their food, but they're not super freaked out by them. Well, rats are zoonotic vectors. I think you guys learned about this, but vectors are something that spreads a disease from one being to another, and rats can spread a few diseases. Today, the most dangerous would be leptospirosis that people could catch from coming into contact with a rat or animal waste. So that is why they're a good carrier disease, because they carry diseases that people can catch. Rats actually are not responsible for most major pandemics that historians study. Historians are interested in things like typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis. Typhoid and tuberculosis are spread person to person, and cholera is spread through unsanitary drinking water, which I suppose rats could contribute to water being unsanitary, but you wouldn't think of rats as the primary vector for cholera. Rats are, however, responsible for one of the most famous pandemics in history, and that is the Black Plague that started in earnest in 1347, and by 1350 had killed 1/3 of the European population, which is devastating and difficult, I think, for us to understand how upsetting this was to medieval people. There weren't even in some cities enough people to bury the dead, so you'd kind of just have to put the dead bodies out on the street where there's all the other mess, and hopefully people would be able to deal with it in the future. Plague is really gross. You get covered in these gigantic sores. The buboes, they are humongous, extremely painful, and people didn't know, doctors didn't know, should we drain them, should we leave them? People in the medieval period kind of thought, oh, well, maybe there's something gross in there that we can get out now. Nothing's going to help unless you have an antibiotic. The song Ring Around the Rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The ashes refers to the blackness that would show on your skin, these really dark lesions, buboes, something that little kids, I guess, would sing to try and deal with the plague. So yeah, it's not a pleasant sickness, and people were very, very frightened of it. So rats saying they're totally responsible for the Black Plague is not really fair, because it's really spread more by the fleas that hang out on rats. The rats themselves are sick. The rats contracted bubonic plague in Asia and were brought over on trading ships. This is a pandemic caused by early globalization. So the rats bring over the plague, but the fleas bite the rats and jump off and bite people. It's unlikely that rats alone could have caused such a devastating disease to spread, because people wouldn't have been being bitten repeatedly by rats. If they touched a rat who had died of plague, they could catch it, but it's really the fleas biting people that is causing this disease to spread so quickly. Well, but the plague is actually likely two types of disease. Bubonic plague is caused by rats. It's so named because of the large black buboes that form under your armpit and on your arms and legs when you catch the disease. And also pneumonic plague, which is a respiratory illness. So in addition to the fleas, it was likely passed person to person as well. It's quite difficult for historians to say conclusively that a disease that we read about now was this. It was definitely bubonic plague, because we're relying on descriptions from people of the medieval period who understand their bodies quite differently than we understand ours today. So what they describe as a symptom might not be something that we can understand and classify. However, I think this is a very well educated guess that it is a mix of these two types of plague. Well, people certainly didn't know that it was rats or fleas that was making them sick. There are three major causes that people of the medieval period would have ascribed this cataclysmic event to. Number one is the prevailing medical theory of the time called miasma theory. The idea behind miasma theory is that you can smell something, particularly something that smells bad, and this will make you sick. The disease malaria, it literally means mal area, bad air. So this is the mindset of people, that they're smelling something bad. And of course, in a medieval city, there's lots of bad things to smell. So, people would try and do things like burn herbs that smell better, or carry something scented to try and protect themselves, not realizing that it's fleas or coughing from a sick person that's actually making them ill. But even though miasma theory is a little bit goofy to us today, it has some good ideas behind it. You do want to avoid something that has a rotting or very sick smell to it. And leaving the city, which was something that medieval people who had enough money could do to avoid the plague, would protect you, because you're getting away from infected people and from infected animals and fleas. The other theories are the idea of prejudice and scapegoating. Unfortunately, people in the medieval period were very wary of people who had different ethnic or religious backgrounds themselves. Of course, we think of the plague, kind of primarily starting in Italy, a very Catholic country, and they're wary of people who practice Judaism or other religions, and they suggest that these people are maybe poisoning the water supply, which is of course patently false and does not have any scientific basis. But unfortunately, this could lead to violence against people of other religious groups, as Christian Europeans tried to protect themselves from this disease. The third idea, which might be difficult for us to fully understand today, but I think we've heard of this with other diseases, sort of being a sign from God, a direct communication from God that people are not behaving properly and that he needs to do something to sort of wake them up and make them behave. So he sends this serious trial to them where they have this opportunity to lead a better life. So a lot of people thought, oh, we have to be more penitent and show God how sorry we are so that he will remove this plague. And people would take this to the extreme, and some would even go around the streets beating themselves with whips, just having these processions where they're beating themselves so that they're trying to show God, we're really serious and we're really sorry. Other people, though, however, just thought, what, it seems like the world's gonna end. Everyone I know is dying. We should just live it up and have a good time and enjoy these last few days we may have. I don't really think that people in the medieval period would have ascribed this to monsters. They may have thought that it was demons or a bad spiritual force, but I think their main response was to look at themselves and the community and say, we have got to stop sinning. Now, whether they think they're sinning because they're being influenced by the devil is quite likely, but it's still on them to behave better and to appease this angry God that sent this disease. But I think something that helps reduce the likelihood of catching a disease from rats is when people start to realize that streets need to be more sanitary. I think it's almost incomprehensible for us today just how dirty and filthy a city was in the early modern and the medieval periods and before that. But in the 19th century, and I'm most familiar with this in America, although it would have been taking place in Europe and other countries as well, people started to want to clean up their cities. The germ theory was just coming into practice in 19th century America and Europe, but people still held on to ideas of miasma theory. But now they're thinking, maybe we should just get rid of the things that cause us to be sick altogether and have cleaner streets, and especially in wealthier areas where people could afford sanitation, They try and keep places cleaner, and thus there's not garbage and things like that, shelter that's attracting rats. You can get the plague now. You can still get it from animals. Don't touch any animal that you don't know well. But if you do get the plague today, the good news is that you can get help. And if you get help quickly, you will be fine. You just need penicillin. Well, I think the history of medicine is a fascinating way to get into the mindset and the experience of people who lived centuries ago. The plague is a particularly interesting case where a lot survives that lets us know how shocked and upset people were by this serious disease that was striking people seemingly at random because they can't figure out what's causing it. So they produce fascinating works of art where arrows are being shot from heaven, and this is the idea that God's raining down this disease and we need to try and do something to behave ourselves, to cruder drawings of woodcuts with people with the buboes on them and wrapped in shrouds as people are trying to process what's going on around them. It was also gave rise to a famous book which you can still read today. It's the Decameron by Boccaccio, and this is a story about a group of young people from Italy who have the opportunity to leave the cities, go out into the countryside, like I spoke about earlier, is a good way to avoid the plague, and sort of the fun and naughty stories they tell each other and just the good time they have while they're avoiding the plague. I was lucky enough to receive this shirt which has the Black Plague European tour, talking about the first one, 1347 to 1351. The plague is basically eradicated in Europe, the last major